Good day and welcome. You're listening to VOX-OVERRIDE, where we step back from the noise of battle to study the beings who waged it, their histories, their minds, and the truths buried beneath the myth. This is the second lecture in our cycle on the Primarchs. In the first, we opened the cycle with another of the Emperor's sons. Today we turn to the one remembered as the most beautiful of them all, and by many as the one who fell the furthest. Before we begin, a word on how these lectures work. What follows is not a recital of the wiki, but an attempt to truly understand a character, to weigh his motives, to read him closely, and to ask who he really was beneath the legend. I will lean on the sources where they matter and offer my own reading where it is warranted, and you are free to disagree. So settle in. This will not be brief, and it is not meant to be. Today we turn to Fulgrim. He is known by several names: the Phoenician, the Illuminator, and, in the Old Tongue, the Phoenix. He is the Primarch of the 3rd Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the legion known as the Emperor's Children. Before his fall, Fulgrim was famed for two things: an extraordinary physical beauty and a fanatical pursuit of perfection. Perfection of the body, of the mind, and of the spirit. In every aspect of existence, without exception, he strove to be flawless. There were good reasons for that striving, and we will come to them. For a long time, it was the Primarch's greatest strength, but in the end, it became his ruin. The desire to be first in all things curdled in time into pride, into vanity, into arrogance. And when chaos finally reached out and touched Fulgrim, it was those qualities that answered. A being who had always been sensitive, always empathic, went looking for the true limit of his own capabilities, and went too far, and could not find the way back. Fulgrim is often named as the first of the Primarchs to be raised to demonhood by the dark gods, though I should note that in the older lore, this happened much later, well after the Horus Heresy, whereas the modern account places his ascension during the war itself. You know the tale of the angel Exterminatus, and you know what came of it. He was the only brother who supported Horus out of neither some old, festering grievance, nor cold ulterior calculation, nor sheer madness. Not like the Alpha Legion with their schemes, not like Kurz with his descent into insanity. So why did this brilliant Primarch fall? He, alone among his brothers, was granted the right to bear the golden aquila upon his armor. What that honor meant, we will explore. And there are harder questions still. The matter of his betrayal, and of his killing of Ferrus Manus, a brother he was closer to than any other, closer even than he was to Horus. It is held that Fulgrim and Ferrus were friends in the truest sense of the word, nearer to one another than Ferrus ever was to the War Master himself. And many believe that Fulgrim's motives are simple and well understood. Those people are mistaken, because the most imperfect of the Primarchs, and he called himself exactly that, the most imperfect, possessed at the same time the most perfect soul of them all, and I intend to prove it to you. The name and the titles. As always, I begin with the name. Fulgrim, in that exact form, does not, of course, exist. It plainly derives from the Latin fulgor, meaning lightning. But for our purposes, the more interesting relative is the Spanish fulgor, which translates as dazzling or resplendent. And there is no doubt that Fulgrim was always precisely that, the most striking of all the brothers. The title, Phoenix, seems the more straightforward. It is an allusion to the mythical bird of Egyptian and classical legend, famed for being reborn from its own death. And the Phoenix speaks directly to the fate of the 3rd Legion, which very nearly perished from a strange genetic defect. When only 200 warriors remained, the Emperor found Fulgrim and the Primarch's own gene seed saved his sons. Through immense effort, he later brought the Legion back to a viable strength. He quite literally raised the Emperor's children from the ashes, when they themselves no longer believed they could ever be a true Legion again. That is the most obvious reading of the name. But there is a subtler allusion, one that plays on the closeness of the words Phoenician and Phoenix. The Phoenicians were an ancient people of the coast of what is now Lebanon. Beyond their gift for seafaring, they were famed as the first on earth to discover the purple dye. It was extraordinarily costly, and so purple robes, shot through in particular with bands of gold, were worn only by the ruling elite. And the heraldic colors of the Emperor's children are precisely purple and gold. And finally, that older title, the Phoenix of the Palatine. The Palatine is the chief and highest of the 7 hills of Rome. It was upon the Palatine, by legend, that the city was founded. Archaeologically, it is one of the oldest inhabited sites in Europe. The presence of that epithet is meant to underline Fulgrim's exceptional nature, and it rounds out the whole aesthetic of the Legion with its taste for classical grandeur. Yet here too, there is a deeper layer. The name of the Palatine Hill is bound to the name of the god Pales, the head of the ancient Italic pantheon, honored as the god of herdsmen and shepherds. And that reading, the shepherd god, carried a double meaning. Pales was called the shepherd of the Italic people, which is to say, quite literally, the divine guide of a nation. The festivals held in his honor were bright, riotous affairs that ran for several days. All of this sits very close to the image of the Phoenician. And note that the myths of Pales are fragmentary. It is not even entirely clear whether Pales was a god or a goddess. That gender ambiguity is itself a quiet foreshadowing of Fulgrim's fate. For we know well what he became after his fall, if not in body, then in spirit. In John French's Slaves to Darkness, he is shown plainly to be a creature who scruples at nothing and who stands on both sides of every line. And those wild celebrations in honor of Pallas point us straight toward the sensual excess of Slanesh, the god to whom Fulgrim would ascend. There is a third allusion in the Palatine. It is upon that same hill that the famous cave lies, the one where the she-wolf suckled Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. It is called the Lupercal, and so the link between the Palatine and Lupercal reflects the closeness of Horus and Fulgrim. The homeworld, Chemos. Now to the Primarch's story. Fulgrim's descent capsule came down on the world of Chemos. Imperial cartographers first classed it a mining world, later a civilized world. In the present day, Chemos is a death world, for after the Horus Heresy, it was scoured clean by loyalist forces. Chemos was never a kind place. It was lit, faintly, by 2 dim suns, but wrapped in a thick shroud of dust and cosmic debris, so that there was no real day and no real night. The world lived in perpetual half-light. It had been colonized for the vast mineral wealth beneath its surface. But at some point, it was cut off entirely by warp storms, sealed away, even from the nearest systems. All of that might have been survived. The real curse of Chemos was that, apart from ore, the planet had nothing. Even its food had come from outside, before the storm severed the routes. When the people of Chemos found themselves isolated from the rest of the galaxy, famine came. Centuries passed before they managed to produce synthetic food, and that technology existed only in a handful of factory fortresses, which thereby held the entire population in their grip. People had to labor ceaselessly for a scrap of the tasteless synthetic paste that would extend their gray existence one more day. Within a few decades, most of the population had died. The survivors gathered around the factory fortresses that made the food. By then, the people of Chemos had forgotten what art was, forgotten the very joys of life. Every pleasure had been sacrificed to the single imperative of survival. When the capsule bearing Fulgrim struck the planet, it came down near the factory fortress of Calex. 3 laborers found the child. A spring of clear water had welled up where the capsule had fallen, and so they named the boy Fulgrim, after the water-bringer of the Chemos creation. Myth. Recognizing that this was no ordinary human child, but something more, they took him in, though the harsh clan law of that dying world would sooner have left any orphan to die, for every mouth was one too many. Fulgrim grew swiftly, as a Primarch does. It soon became clear that he could labor not merely for days, but for weeks on end, without pause, and that he understood, by instinct, the working of every machine in the factory fortress and how each might be modified to yield more. By the age of 15, he had risen to engineer and then to one of the senior administrators, climbing rung by the sweat of his brow. By then, he had already grasped that not only his own fortress but all of Chemos was dying slowly, choked by the exhaustion of its resources and by an antique clan system of rule. What grieved the future Primarch, most of all, was that the people of Chemos simply did not know how to feel joy. Their bleak existence, lived for survival alone, was an offense against Fulgrim's very nature, and he swore that he would give the people back the joy of living and turn this dying world into a thriving one. The renewal of Chemos. Having set himself that goal, Fulgrim spent some months persuading the Executive Council of Calex to commit to the renewal of the planet. Under his direction, a party of engineers and prospectors was sent out to long-abandoned outposts and mine workings that everyone had written off as spent. Fulgrim modernized much of Chemos's machinery, the mining engines among it, and contrived to reach the ore at deeper levels than before. The old shafts were reopened, and the swelling flow of resources let the Primarch build more sophisticated machines of higher efficiency, which in turn drew out still more. It became a closed, rising cycle. More resources, better machines, and round again. In the end, for the first time in thousands of years, the factory produced more than it consumed. And for the first time in thousands of years, honest smiles appeared on people's faces. First in one fortress, then in the others, joy returned. There was leisure now, and people spent it not only on rest. Poetry and painting and the other arts came back to life. Then Fulgrim unlocked the science of terraforming. He grew forests upon the planet, filled its oceans with water, and the flora he engineered was adapted to the eternal twilight. Despite the want of any true sunlight, Chemos became a thriving world. The one thing Fulgrim could not do was reach orbit and clear the cloud of debris around the planet, and it may well be that this was simply impossible. Precisely 50 years after his capsule fell, he had not only restored Chemos to what it once was, but made it better than it had ever been before the colony. In that time, the future Primarch had united the planet under his rule, for none could argue with the sheer scale of his achievements, which granted him an unanswerable right to lead. Fulgrim was a scholar more than a warlord. On Chemos, there was scarcely anyone to fight. The factory fortresses might in theory have fallen into civil war, but no one pursued it. The cost in resources was too great, plainly uneconomic. And so no one kept armies either. The nearest thing to professional soldiers were the overseers who policed the workers on the factory floors. Once more, towers of gold and crystal rose over Chemos. Intellectual life came to outweigh mere physical toil, And Fulgrim, just as he had sworn, gave the people back their spirit and their joy. And then, out of the sky, without warning, came ships bearing the imperial Aquila. The meeting with the Emperor. When Fulgrim saw those ships, what rose in him was not a memory, but a knowledge, something written into his very gene code. Since there was no one to fight on Chemos, and he had no true army, he ordered what few overseers remained to cordon off the landing site of the unknown ships, while he himself went out to meet the strangers alone. When he saw warriors clad in shining armor, he understood that they were the embodiment of everything he had striven toward on Chemos. And when, from their ranks, the master of mankind stepped forth, Fulgrim knew at once, without a single question, who stood before him. He went down upon one knee and swore his fealty. It is not known exactly when the reunion of Fulgrim and the Emperor took place, but according to the archival records of the Mechanicum, the battle barge Pride of the Emperor, which was first to reach Chemos, left the shipyards of Mars over a century and a half before the Heresy began. On the way to Terra, the Emperor told Fulgrim of the Great Crusade, of his brother Primarchs, and that under Fulgrim's command, there would soon stand a whole legion of transhuman warriors. But upon reaching the throne world, Fulgrim discovered, to his horror, that through a genetic defect of unknown origin, most of the warriors implanted with his gene seed had simply died. Only 200 legionaries remained. The Primarch addressed them with a speech so impassioned, so uplifting, that every one of the Astartes was filled with a sincere love and admiration for his father. The warriors understood that the days of the Legion were not numbered after all, that together with their father, they would win the greatness for which they had been made. And so it came to pass, through the gene seed of the now fully grown Primarch, the genetic defect was overcome, and the Emperor's children began to rebuild their numbers, recruiting from 2 worlds at once, Chemos and Terra. A small aside. In the writings on the Legion's founding, it is said that the making of a Legion from a Primarch's gene seed proceeded in several stages, and that one of those stages involved only a fragmentary, partial implantation of the Primarch's seed, meant to unlock a certain part of a warrior's combat potential, enough to test him in real battle. It is notable that in one case, the process failed, and there were problems with a particular legion from the very beginning, a matter we touched upon in the stream on the Lost Primarchs. In all likelihood, the legion in question was Fulgrim's own, and after he had restored it, the Primarch ordered these records struck from the Imperial archives. Returning to how Fulgrim revived his legion, it was then that he earned the title Phoenix, and to be worthy of the honor the Emperor had shown him, the Primarch resolved to attain perfection in every aspect of life. This became not merely a doctrine of war, but a creed for living. The Emperor's children ceaselessly perfected themselves in tactics and strategy, in swordsmanship, in oratory, in the applied crafts. One chose painting, another poetry, another sculpture, as Fulgrim himself did, and there were more exotic arts besides. Fulgrim spoke of perfection, not only within, but without, insisting that the vessel must be worthy of what it holds. It is for this reason that the Third Legion is known for the most striking armor of all, purple and gold, a noble pairing. More than that, the legionary's warplate was often decorated in a unique artistic technique, ibru, or marbling, exceptionally difficult to master. Hair and cosmetics, too, played no small part in the culture of the Emperor's children. And Fulgrim himself, with his silver hair, his vivid purple eyes, his high cheekbones, was the perfect emblem of that pursuit of outward perfection, and was reckoned a warrior of exceptional beauty. The motive, the philosophy of perfection. Here, we must weigh the Phoenicians' motives correctly. In the beginning, there was not one drop of pride or vanity in his striving for perfection, and this is no supposition of mine, but the plain testimony of certain characters which I will come to in the closing analysis. Fulgrim held that humanity was the crown of evolution. By the 31st millennium, nature no longer shaped the development of our species. Our own technology had brought the human race to the very edge of its potential, embodied in the transhuman. The time had come, then, for personal self-perfection. Fulgrim believed that in every aspect of life, any human being might rise to heights enough to be called a genius in that field. And every aspect of life he reduced in a sense to art. For him, life itself was an art, one that could be honed to flawlessness, to answer fully to the idea of the ideal. Such a striving toward perfection can hardly be called destructive or wrong, not until it tips over into fanaticism. And what is striking is that for all his pursuit of perfection in everything, Fulgrim understood perfectly well that he himself had attained the ideal in nothing. This is well shown in his private reflections, and in the story The Reflection Cracked, where, sparring alone, as though against Ferrus, he is not angered by his own imperfection. He knew perfectly well that he was far from flawless, but unlike Ferrus, he saw in that a challenge. Every day, he strove to win the endless duel with himself, becoming better and better. That idea appealed to his sons, and it should appeal to any of us. It cannot be denied that Fulgrim also had a pragmatic motive. By the time he took command of his legion, most of his brothers had already won considerable renown in war, and he, with his 200 warriors, could not fight full campaigns alone, and so for many years he fought within expeditionary fleets commanded by other brothers, often alongside the Luna Wolves, the Iron Hands, the Ultramarines, the Thousand Suns. Naturally, Fulgrim wished to prove to his brothers that he was no lesser than they, that he could lead his warriors to the stars unaided and conquer new worlds for the future of mankind. There is a certain vanity in that, but in the striving to be first, there is nothing destructive. On the contrary, rivalry and the desire to be best among equals drive a being to grow. And unlike Ferrus, Fulgrim was never embittered. It was only in one unlucky moment that the ruinous powers played upon that rivalry and turned the Primarch's strength into his weakness. Seeing nothing greater before him, Fulgrim could not help but take the fatal step. But why that happened, who was to blame, and what might have been done, I will examine in more detail later. One more thing bears mentioning. When the Emperor's children were granted the right to bear the imperial aquila, and just how it differed from the ordinary one we do not truly know. It happened before their Primarch was even found. During the compliance of the world of Proxima, insurrectionists had got hold of a vortex weapon and made an attempt upon the life of the Emperor himself. The Master of Mankind survived only through the sacrifice of the Legio Custodes and several squads of the Emperor's children who died to the last man, but bought the wounded Emperor time to fight his way clear of the trap. In Fulgrim's private reflections, it is noted that he grieved deeply over those events, but not because his sons had won their greatest honor without him. He grieved because, had he been on Proxima, many of the deaths might have been avoided. I will quote him. One more triumphal arch, built from the bones of dead legionaries. Had he been there, he felt, they might not have died. This bears upon the question of Fulgrim's humanity, his love for his sons and for people in general, and just how genuine a humanist he truly was, I will confirm a little later. The friendship with Ferrus Manus, the Forge contest. Now to his friendship with Ferrus. Ferrus and Fulgrim first met on Terra, at Mount Narodnaya in the southern Urals. In that region stood the greatest forge complex on the planet, belonging to the Terrawat clan, founded before the Age of Unity. When Fulgrim entered the forge, Ferrus Manus was already at work there and had been for a long while. His uncanny hands, gleaming a matte silver in the fire of the furnace, were beautiful and strange to behold. The moment the Phoenician crossed the threshold, he declared that he had come to forge the finest weapon ever made to lead his warriors in the Great Crusade. Ferrus laughed and told him that such fine and delicate hands were plainly unsuited to the smith's craft and could scarcely attain the mastery the Primarch of the Iron Hands possessed. Fulgrim took up the challenge at once. As the tale is told, both Primarchs, looking one another in the eye, stripped to the waist, took up their smithing hammers and worked for 3 months without pause, finishing their masterworks at the very same moment. Fulgrim forged a magnificent warhammer, Forgebreaker, able to level a mountain with a single blow. And from beneath the impossible hands of Ferrus Manus came a golden-bladed sword, Fireblade, that burned forever with the fire of 1,000 forges. Both weapons came out flawless, without equal. Seeing the Fireblade that Ferrus had made, Fulgrim conceded at once that his brother had won the contest, for that sword was worthy of legend, the equal of any ever forged. But when Ferrus looked upon the hammer the Phoenician had made, he shook his head and said that it was not he who had won but his brother, for Fulgrim had forged a weapon fit for the gods, an obvious echo of the hammer of Thor. Neither could settle who had truly won, and so they simply exchanged weapons, Fulgrim taking the Fireblade, Ferrus the hammer, and so their friendship began. By one account, it was Fulgrim who gave Ferrus the name Gorgon. After the contest in the forges, they returned to the Imperial Palace, and Fulgrim presented his brother with many magnificent works, wrought by the finest masters from precious stones and metals. Fulgrim was delighted and moved to find that one of his brothers was, like him, a true devotee of the applied crafts and the arts. Ferrus merely snorted. What use, he said, were such trinkets? And in answer, the Phoenician laughed and called his brother a terrible Gorgon. Ferrus took to the name for 2 reasons. First, he thought himself ugly and fearsome, the very opposite of Fulgrim's beauty, within and without, and likened himself to a monster out of the old myths. And second, as he put it, many of his foes were quite literally turned to stone by his gaze, a plain allusion to the myth of the Gorgon. The early campaigns, Byzas, and the First Worlds. Fulgrim was friends not only with the Gorgon, but with Horus. Together with Lupercal, he spent a long while bringing worlds to compliance, and between those 2 Primarchs, there was a genuine warmth. At a certain point, the Phoenician decided he was ready to act alone. To prove it to his brothers, Fulgrim resolved to conquer the world of Byzas, designated 28-1, a developed feudal world, and to do it with just 7 of his sons. Though the compliance was far from perfect, at one moment Fulgrim nearly perished through his own miscalculation, as those who have read the novel know. He did indeed bring that turbulent feudal world to heel without committing his main strength, which was, without question, a thing unheard of. After that victory, the 28th Expeditionary Fleet was placed under his command, and he set out at last to wage a campaign of his own. Here, a real question arises about how many worlds the Emperor's children conquered alone. There were not many. In the novel Fulgrim by Graham McNeill, the 5th in the Horus Heresy cycle, it is said that the Laer world was the 3rd brought to compliance by the 28th Fleet. Whether Byzas is counted among them is unclear, but either way, by that point, the Emperor's children had taken 3 or 4 worlds. Set against the achievements of a Dorn or a Guilliman, that is modest indeed. Though it must be said that the Phoenician was never interested in how many worlds he conquered. What always mattered to him was how they were conquered. The Laer, the Daemon Blade. The Laer world, which the Imperium designated 28-3, was a magnificent ocean world of exceptional beauty, its people dwelling upon islands that floated above the seas. The natives, the Laer, were in essence classical Nagas, serpent folk. They were a highly advanced, sentient race who held the highest virtue to be perfection in every aspect of life. War among them, which they too counted an art. The Laer would not yield the resources of their world to the Imperium, and Fulgrim, for obvious reasons, admired them sincerely. Their fanatical striving for the ideal had let such creatures reach a level of technology that in certain respects surpassed the Imperium's own. In particular, through some natural catastrophe, their world had at last gone under the water, and they had contrived to lift into the air the land that remained to them. But their greatest triumphs were in the field of genetic engineering. Through selective breeding and various practices, they had refined their own bodies until they were very nearly the equal, one-on-one, of a space marine. Fulgrim admired them, but he did not know the most important thing. The Laer had long been under the sway of the Dark Prince Slaanesh. Their serpent priests conducted their perverse rites to the Lord of Pleasures day and night in the underground temples of those floating islands. And here is the most telling thing. Fate itself, in truth, tried to shield Fulgrim from the reckless step he was about to take. On its preliminary assessments, the Council of Terra ruled that the conquest of the Laer would take no fewer than 10 Terran years and would be uneconomic. But the Phoenician took that ruling as a challenge and declared that he would take the world not in 10 years, but in a month. He achieved his aim. Deep within the central island, he was surprised to find that the serpent priests were guarding not some vital installation, nor the palace of their rulers, but a temple. And at the heart of the temple, upon a plinth of black stone, stood an elegant silver blade that served at the same time as the very foundation of the structure. Fulgrim did not know that the blade was an artifact of chaos and served as the vessel for a great demon of Slaanesh. Because the Emperor had told his children nothing of the ruinous powers, save one, but that is another story. The defenses of Fulgrim's mind could not grasp what stood before him, nor what danger this Laer blade in truth held. Taking up the artifact, the Primarch fell at once under the demon's influence, and it began, slowly, steadily, to corrupt the Phoenician's nature. Those legionaries who had set foot on the Laer world were touched by Slaanesh as well. The planet was in the end scoured utterly, and the Laer ceased to exist as a species, for this was less a compliance than an outright genocide, an extermination, because the Laer would never have surrendered otherwise. The Diasporex, the saving of Fulgrim. At around that same time, Ferrus Manus met a unique nomadic civilization known as the Diasporex, made up of humans and several Xenos species. Having renounced the imperial truth, the Diasporex managed to cripple one of Ferrus's strike cruisers, and for many months eluded a pitched battle, slipping away from the whole fleet of the Iron Hands. The Gorgon was forced to call his brother to his aid, Fulgrim's 28th Fleet. In the end, the two imperial fleets defeated the Diasporex by a stratagem. During the general engagement, and this is a crucial moment, Fulgrim's flagship came to the very brink of destruction, and it was only through the self-sacrifice of Ferrus Manus that the Phoenician was saved. Given all we have said, their friendship, born back at Mount Narodnaya, it would have been only logical for the true Fulgrim to thank his brother for that rescue, and for the bonds between them to grow stronger still after that campaign. But by then, the Phoenician was no longer wholly himself, for the demon dwelling in the Laer blade had corrupted his perception and drawn to the surface his ego and his pride. Those feelings had always been in the Primarch, as I will explain in the analysis, but he had always kept them in check, never letting them rule him, never letting them poison his bonds with his brothers or with ordinary people. The demon, as they always do, threw him from the saddle by finding that very weakness and worrying at it. There is an analogy here with the demonology of the old religions, where possession works precisely through a weakness. And so what was in reality an act of self-sacrifice and care on the part of Ferrus, a true deed of heroism, Fulgrim took as reckless, foolish meddling and as an attempt to insult the Emperor's children, as if they could not manage on their own. Tarsus, the Elder's warning, the turn to treason. Soon after the destruction of the Diasporex, during a joint campaign of the Iron Hands and the Emperor's children, an elder seer invited Fulgrim to Tarsus, one of the so-called Maiden Worlds, a group of planets terraformed by the Eldar, dead worlds made into magnificent, beautiful places for settlement, not at once, but at some time in the future. By this point, Horus had already been raised up, and the dark gods had gained power over his soul. The seer knew this and tried to warn the Phoenician what Lupercal intended. But the Primarch of the Emperor's children did not believe the Eldar. First, because he loved Horus scarcely less than he loved Ferrus, and second, because the demon had by now spent a long while corrupting his soul and reshaping how he saw the world. I say again, by this point, Fulgrim was no longer himself. It came to a battle in which the whole of the Phoenicians' guard would have died, but Fulgrim managed to destroy a summoned avatar of Cain, a moment that will matter greatly, and to which we will return. The Eldar withdrew then, understanding that the Emperor's children were already poisoned by the ruinous powers, something the transhumans themselves could not see. After this, Fulgrim, in his fury, subjected several of the Maiden Worlds to virus bombing and resolved to meet Horus in person, for the seer had, after all, planted a seed of doubt in his soul. And in the meeting of those two Primarchs, Lupercal, through the demonic charisma granted to him, managed at last to bend Fulgrim toward treason, a treason that was, by then, already in him in some small measure. Ever loyal to his father, Fulgrim came to believe that the Emperor's claims were impossible limits set upon the human race, that the Emperor was fettering mankind on the road to true self-perfection. As a token of trust, Horus gave Fulgrim a gift, and, leaving part of his legion with Lupercal, the Phoenicians set out to aid Ferrus Manus, who by then was bringing yet another people to compliance. Fulgrim still counted Manus a true friend beyond doubt, and was certain he could win him to Horus's side. How much of the original Fulgrim was still alive by then, we can only guess, but he was certainly no longer answerable for his actions. The ruinous powers were promising him boundless capabilities and the very ideal he had always sought. But about Ferrus he was gravely mistaken. The loyalty of Manus proved unbreakable, and a fight broke out between the brothers, in which the Phoenician gained the upper hand, but could not bring himself to kill his old friend. Despite the demon's urgings, the Primarch of the Third Legion managed, for a short while, to master the demon that had all but wholly seized his soul. As he left the flagship, he ordered the Gorgon's guard, the Morlocks, put to the sword. After Fulgrim quit the ship, there came a brief engagement in which the ships of the Emperor's children opened fire, without warning, on the fleet of the Iron Hands, and then withdrew, through the warp. Isstvan, the purging of the legends. And so 3 legions that by then had already given themselves to the dark gods, the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters, carried out a purge of their own ranks, exterminating the sincerely loyal elements among them. Thanks to the actions of Lucius, some of the loyal legionaries of the Emperor's children on the surface were warned of the virus bombing, and, as we know, in the end, not only Garviel Loken, of the Sons of Horus, survived, but a few others besides. Here, a small aside is needed. Fulgrim and the whole high command of the Emperor's children gave themselves wholly over to Slaanesh during the so-called Maraviglia, a masterwork symphony written by the legendary composer Bekwa Kinska, who was attached to the Phoenicians' 28th Fleet. This composer had been in that temple on the Laer world with the Emperor's children and had been touched by the corrupting influence of the warp. The symphony she wrote was so unnatural that it tore the boundary between the real world and the immaterium. This had a whole train of consequences. First, mutations among the Space Marines and the mortals. The chief concert hall of the Pride of the Emperor, La Fenite, was packed with mortals, all of whom mutated, and the whole thing spilled over into a mad orgy of mass murder in which even the demonettes of Slaanesh took part, having stepped across the boundary of worlds. It was during the Maraviglia that the so-called Noise Marines first appeared, the Cacophony. Under the command of the first captain, Julius Caesaron, and the third captain, Marius Virosean, who would later lead them, they first turned their acoustic weapons upon their own loyalist brothers during the atrocity at Isstvan III, tearing them apart. That was the true debut of a unique corps of warriors that no one else possesses, one that will go on fighting for thousands of years across countless worlds. They fought at Isstvan V as well. After the purge at Isstvan III, Horus openly declared his rebellion, and 3 loyal legions, the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands, made for Isstvan V, where Lupercal was based with the brothers loyal to him. During the battle that would later be called the Drop Site Massacre, Ferrus Manus at the landing gave way to the wrath so characteristic of him and did not heed Vulcan's counsel. He did not pull his legion back to regroup because he desired one thing only, a duel with Fulgrim. And the Lord of the Iron Hands got his wish. He broke through the enemy front, and while the Morlocks battled Fulgrim's elite, the Phoenix Guard, the 2 brothers met in mortal combat. In that savage fight, both took grievous wounds, and Ferrus very nearly gained the upper hand. But Fulgrim suddenly drew the Laer blade and drove it into the chest of Manus. The blade was not only the prison of a demon, it was also a mighty artifact of colossal power, lending Fulgrim its strength. Standing over his brother, the Phoenician realized of a sudden that he could not deliver the final blow. For an instant his clarity returned, and he understood how low he had fallen by then, what monstrous crimes he had committed, and what he was about to do at that very moment. He saw that this new road was his most terrible mistake, and that there was, most likely, no longer any way back. Even so, the last grains of the true Fulgrim soul went on fighting the encroaching dark, though the demon had all but wholly claimed him. Fulgrim strained every muscle to hold back the Laer blade. He saw the fallen Ferrus reach out toward Forgebreaker, the hammer he himself had forged and given his brother. Ferrus, in all likelihood, was ready in that moment to accept death at the hand of his brother and friend. Fulgrim was fighting the demon within himself, so as not to kill Ferrus, and he saw him reach for the weapon, and he was ready to accept his own end. But in the end, the demon seized control, and the head of the Primarch of the 10th Legion was struck from his body. Standing over his brother's ruined body, the fallen phoenix saw everything, for the first time, in its true light. He grasped at last that since the conquest of the Laer, he had ceased to be himself. He saw the lie of Horus and the full depth of the catastrophe unfolding on the black sands of Isstvan and across the galaxy. And giving way to a moment's weakness, Fulgrim believed the demon, which promised him that oblivion would bring peace, and willingly gave up his body to the demon imprisoned in the Laer blade, and so was caught in a trap. He regained his own clear consciousness, untainted by the demon's influence, but found himself locked in a prison of the mind. He saw everything that happened around him, but could no longer change any of it. When Fulgrim, or rather the demon in his body, presented the War Master with the head of Ferrus, Horus at first rejoiced, but then the demon declared that the Phoenician had lacked the strength of will to fulfill his oath, and so Slaanesh had done it all itself. Horus understood that the body of his brother was now controlled by an evil thing, but did not dare oppose the demon openly. At that stage of the war, he needed the Emperor's children as allies, and the demon controlled them. Even so, he swore to himself that one day he would free Fulgrim from his imprisonment. And for all others, the Phoenician had to remain himself, because as Horus rightly judged, to reveal that secret would be a grave problem. The Council of the Traitors, Lorgar. Then came a gathering of the Primarchs before Horus, the so-called Council of the Traitors. At that meeting, Lorgar understood at once that a demon occupied Fulgrim's body, all of which is beautifully told in the novella of the same name. Lorgar nearly killed the demon, for according to the understanding of Aurelian and Magnus, the unborn has no right to occupy the body of the born alone. Only in the symbiosis of the two is there true perfection worth striving for. Horus managed to soothe Lorgar's wrath, promising he would deal with the problem himself. And what is telling is that in that situation, the demon locked in Fulgrim's body could in no way stand against the psychic power of Lorgar. Even Horus gave way before him. When he laid a hand upon Lorgar's shoulder, he felt his might and understood that this was no longer the brother he had once known. This confirms once again my theory, set out in the stream on Lorgar, about who Lorgar truly was, what his motives were, and what he was capable of. Of the Emperor's children, only Lucius vaguely suspected at that time that something was wrong with the Primarch. Fulgrim, nominally as a mark of respect, gave him the Laer blade, which by then no longer held the demon, but was still a mighty artifact. Prismatica, Lucius and the Portrait. After the Council of the Traitors, Lupercal ordered the Third Legion to make for Mars, but the Phoenician decided he was not bound to obey the orders of the Martian Magi of Chaos, and directed his legion instead to a mining world under the control of a small Mechanicum contingent. Here is an important moment. Before the assault, the Lord Commander Eidolon, one of the few characters who inspires nothing but distaste, foolishly and publicly questioned Fulgrim's order, suggesting that perhaps they ought, since Horus was War Master and Supreme Commander, to go to Mars. For this, the Phoenician beat Eidolon. That brief exchange convinced Lucius that the being before him was not his Primarch. Beyond that, the swordsman had been having dark, uncanny dreams of the portrait of Fulgrim that hung in La Fenice, which on the Phoenician's order had been wholly sealed off after the Maraviglia. After Fulgrim displayed psychic powers in the campaign, Lucius made his way into La Fenice and saw, in the eyes of the portrait, a genuine terror. The terror, as he took it, of a soul caught in a trap. This is an obvious, if somewhat twisted allusion to the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and it is important to understanding the Phoenician. I will speak of its meaning a little later. Gathering a few warriors of the Brotherhood of the Phoenix, Lucius set an ambush for the Primarch, seized him, and brought him to be tortured, all of which is described in the Reflection Cracked. Though in the story, they overcame him rather easily, and why that was, I will say in a moment. Lucius and Fabius tried to drive out the demon by torture, and cruel torture at that. I reread the passage recently, and it was in the spirit of Torquemada himself. At a certain point, they understood that what stood before them was no longer a demon, but the true Primarch. Lucius understood it first. They released Fulgrim, and he explained that for some time he had indeed been under the demon's power, but had managed to master it, and that the demon was now sealed within that very portrait. And the flaw in his swordsmanship that Lucius had seen, the Primarch had shown on purpose, to observe the swordsman's reaction and see what he would do next. Perturabo, the angel Exterminatus. Soon after these events, Fulgrim contacted Perturabo, who had just concluded a campaign of his own. The Phoenician presented his brother with a fine gift, a magnificent, artful cloak with a skull-shaped clasp, and within the clasp, a stone. Fulgrim persuaded his brother to go with him into the Eye of Terror, promising that together they could find a certain weapon, the so-called Angel Exterminatus, that would tip the scales, once and for all, in the War Master's favor. The Lord of Iron, as we know, was close to none of his brothers, but Fulgrim's striving for perfection in every aspect of life appealed to Perturabo. More than that, since childhood, back on Olympia, he had seen the Eye of Terror quite literally through the depths of space, even at colossal distance. All of this played into Fulgrim's hands. In the Eye of Terror, the Emperor's children and the Iron Warriors found an Eldar crone world and landed upon the planet of Idris. At its heart stood an ancient citadel, the Amun Nishak Kailas, and within it, the so-called Tomb of Fate, where, so Fulgrim claimed, the Angel Exterminatus lay. They reached the tomb only through the logical genius of Perturabo, who found the path through the labyrinth of the citadel. But within the tomb, the Lord of Iron and Fulgrim were opposed no longer merely by traps, but by wraith constructs, Wraithguard and Wraith Lords, roused from their slumber, animate constructs driven by Eldar spirit stones. Perturabo, of course, knew that Fulgrim would betray him sooner or later. For all his faults, he was no fool. Yet he wished to walk that road to its end, to see with his own eyes what the Angel Exterminatus truly was, and to understand why he himself had been drawn to the Eye of Terror since childhood. In the end, it turned out that the clasp on the cloak Fulgrim had given Perturabo, the Maugatar stone, had been steadily draining the Lord of Iron's power. When Perturabo grasped this, he looked into his brother's eyes and saw not a drop of remorse. He understood that the Fulgrim he had once known was gone, and he cast the stone down a shaft that fell toward the planet's core. But it was too late. By then, the artifact had already absorbed the power of 2 Primarchs, multiplied it, and passed it to the Phoenician, restoring his strength. Perturabo shattered the mortal shell of Fulgrim, and he was reborn in the form of a champion of Slaanesh. That is to say, it all happened just as Fulgrim had intended. It was all for this that it happened, and he knew exactly how Perturabo would act. Every part of it was thought through. In essence, it was a ritual of ascension. After this, the Emperor's children left the crumbling world in a flash of teleportation. All of it is described in the novel of the same name, Angel Exterminatus. In that battle, the so-called Shattered Legions took part. Aboard the ship, Sisypheum, they had been pursued by the traitors from the very start. It was there that Lucius died for the first time. As far as I recall, it was the first time. He was outmatched in a duel by a warrior of the Raven Guard. The Sisypheum later managed to escape the fleet of the Iron Warriors and dived into a black hole at the center of the Eye of Terror, which tells us that we must always go forward to the very end. After the Heresy, the Legend Wars, the duel with Guilliman. 7 years after these events, Horus gathered the traitor legions before finally turning his armada toward Terra. By that point of the ascended Primarchs, only Lorgar and Perturabo remained at his side, while Fulgrim and Angron, likewise now ascended, were elsewhere. Fulgrim and Angron were roaming the warp, wholly unwilling to join what seemed to them the petty war of the War Master. Lupercal sent Perturabo to bring back Angron, and the returning of Fulgrim fell to Lorgar. Through a sorcerer of the Word-Bearers, Fulgrim was taken captive. By then, Lorgar had lost all faith in Horus. He meant to weaken the War Master psychically and set the captive Phoenician upon him. All of it described in detail in Slaves to Darkness by John French. Lorgar was certain that Fulgrim, even in the shape of a demon, would be enough to destroy Lupercal, even in the shape of a demon because, by common account, Fulgrim had been mighty to begin with, and as a demon prince, all the more so. But Lorgar's plans were not to come to pass. His scheme was uncovered. Fulgrim was freed, and Horus, as we know, nearly killed Lorgar, driving him off with the promise that he would in the end kill him after all, which later came true. After these events, Fulgrim once more took command of the Emperor's children. Just what he did during the Siege of Terra, the earlier novels left almost blank. Only in the final books of the siege is he shown at Terra at all, and even there, tellingly, he grows bored of the war and abandons it. What we do know is that on the throne world, the Emperor's children slaughtered the civilian population more than they fought the defenders. And after the death of Horus, like most of the traitor legions, they withdrew into the Eye of Terror, leaving behind them worlds ravaged and drowned in blood. Such was the terror they spread that the Emperor's children were dreaded more even than the Night Lords. The one will simply kill you and take your skin, but the other will violate you first. In time, the Emperor's children provoked a chain of conflicts within the Eye of Terror, known as the Legion Wars, among the traitor legions. Those wars finally destroyed what little remained of any brotherhood between them, and then the Emperor's children themselves splintered into a host of independent warbands. Fulgrim no longer led them. He cared nothing at all for his sons now. His egocentrism was absolute. This is in no way the original Fulgrim. In real space, he appears again only in the year 121 of M31 at the Battle of Thessala, where he crosses blades with Robot Guilliman. During that duel, through the warp, the Phoenician saw the scar in the place where, at the Battle of Calth, Cor Farron had wounded Guilliman with his athame. Fulgrim struck that same place with a poisoned blade and opened the throat of the Lord of Ultramar. Guilliman could not be saved, but he was placed in a stasis field to await better times. The return to Isstvan III, Rylanor. After the duel with Guilliman, Fulgrim unexpectedly returned to Isstvan III. It seemed that of the purge, only Garviel Loken had survived, the one called Cerberus. But it turned out that he was not the only one. The ancient and venerable dreadnought of the Emperor's children, Rylanor the Unyielding, had fought on the Loyalist side during the purge. Over the years, he had built a psychic beacon meant to draw the Phoenician back, and he had found, in one of the hangars, an unexploded virus bomb. and putting two and two together, decided that this might serve to kill the Primarch. Fulgrim did indeed come to the beacon's light, and with him a party of legionaries of the Thousand Sons, who had likewise seen it. Fulgrim tore the biological remains from the mechanical body of Rylanor, but the dreadnought managed to arm the bomb. One of the sorcerers of the Thousand Sons wove a kinetic net to save not so much Fulgrim as himself and all who stood nearby. But another legionary of the Thousand Sons, named Vistario, was so appalled by what the Phoenician had become that he killed his brother, the one who had raised the shield. The shield fell, and the atmosphere of Isstvan blazed for a second time. When the ash had settled, a serpentine shadow emerged from the darkness of the ruined hangar. It is held that although Fulgrim returned from death, quite literally moments later, he nonetheless lost his battle with the ancient Rylanor. For Rylanor, before his death, forced the champion of Slaanesh to realize that he was not perfect at all, but quite the opposite. In his pursuit of a sensory apotheosis, the former Primarch of the Third Legion had lost himself, and before him the road closed forever to that sandy, unreachable perfection, ideal only in its unreachability. This, it is said, broke Fulgrim, who never returned to his old legion and wanders somewhere in the warp. The clone of Fabius Bile. Before I turn at last to the analysis of the character, I cannot fail to mention the clone of Bile. It is known that Fabius Bile experimented more than once with cloning Primarchs. At first he did so at Fulgrim's own wish, attempting to clone Ferrus. This is mentioned in the story. The reflection cracked. But the original Primarch could never be recreated. In particular, the hands that Ferrus had thrust into the crater could not be reproduced. I suspect it was simply impossible to clone those other hands. We have no exact record of when it happened, but at some point in M41, Bile succeeded in creating a clone of Fulgrim. Before that, he had made many clones of his genetic father, but only the last of them was an absolute copy of the original Phoenician, the one as yet untouched by the taint of chaos, who had never laid a hand on the Laer blade. The genetic memory of the clone gave him all the memories of the true Fulgrim, and the clone sincerely repented of everything he had done. He was horrified when he remembered that with his own hands he had killed Ferrus. Not quite so, for the demon killed Ferrus by Fulgrim's hands, but the clone was horrified all the same at having been the cause, and he declared that he would do everything possible to atone for his sins. But before he could undertake anything, Bile handed him over to Trazyn the Infinite, who locked the clone away in a stasis field within his gallery world, known as Solemnes. Bile did this because he had understood that he truly had cloned his father. This was, in every sense, the very same Fulgrim. And that meant, as Bile reckoned, that despite his sincere repentance and his equally sincere desire to set everything right, the clone would sooner or later repeat the mistake of his original. The analysis, the humanity of Fulgrim. Now to the closing part, the analysis of the character, with a great many quotations, in particular from his private reflections, from those of Ferrus, and from others. What can we conclude from all that has been said? Fulgrim, from the very beginning, differed sharply from most of his brothers. He never doubted that the conquest of the galaxy was in no way an end, but only a means that would, in the future, let human civilization pursue the thing for which it exists, self-expression, and in particular art. Fulgrim was perhaps the only one of the Primarchs who could truly, sincerely delight in a play, in painting, in sculpture, in poetry. In this, perhaps, only Sanguinius could compare with him. It seems to me that these two Primarchs had a great deal in common, Both were consummate swordsmen. Both were beautiful in soul and in body. Both were empathic and humane, capable of feeling deeply not only for their sons, but for ordinary mortals. Those less familiar with the literary universe may wonder about the humanity, the tenderness, the sincerity of Fulgrim. So as not to be unfounded, I will offer a few quotations. The first is from David Geimer's novel of Ferrus. It is the scene in which one of Fulgrim's own captains, one of the original 200, one of those who know their father better than anyone, makes a bas-relief depicting the civilians of a world that Ferrus is bringing to compliance. He is not alone. It is a combined force of several legions. The Thousand Sons, the Ultramarines, the Emperor's Children. The quotation itself. If I look upon the awe and dread in the faces of these people, feeling so strong that the captain suffered deeply as he reproduced them in the limestone, then surely, for Fulgrim, with his superhuman capacity for empathy, it would be twice as hard to look upon such a thing. The captain wiped away a tear gathering on the copper skin of his cheek. End of quotation. That captain is one of those 200, one of those who know their father best, and weeping over the fate of the civilians of a dying world, he says that it would be still harder for Fulgrim, that his father possesses a superhuman capacity for empathy. Anyone who has read Fulgrim's private reflections and knows of this captain can hardly doubt his words. In support, another passage, this one from Graham McNeil's The Reflection Cracked, which most, I am sure, have not read. These are the words of Lucius, addressing the Fulgrim, in whom, as he believes, a demon dwells. I quote, "I do not know to whom I am speaking now," said Lucius, gazing into Fulgrim's impenetrable eyes. He found there neither compassion nor humanity, nothing that pointed to the master and lord he had served with all his heart. End of quotation. Lucius has, without question, many ill qualities, but he is perceptive, and so I am inclined to trust the judgments he gives of his father. Compassion, humanity, and something more. This is how Lucius describes Fulgrim. I have already mentioned the quotation from Fulgrim's own reflections, where he grieves that, had he been on Proxima, far fewer of the Emperor's children would have died. I will continue it. Sometimes he dreamed of Proxima, or of Luna, or of Jupiter, battles in which the presence of a Primarch might have changed something. Under the command of the Phoenician, his sons would have won at a lesser cost. That is to say, it is nothing to him that honors were won without him. It pains him that they died when he might have saved them. Further, the thoughts of the demon captain, I quote, "Not for the first time," the Phoenician mused with longing upon missed opportunities. It seemed that Fulgrim blamed himself for not taking part in those battles, for not leading his sons to war, as though by his mere presence a son of the Emperor might have prevented the losses of the Third Legion, or the catastrophe that befell them. End of quotation. I think that is enough to understand why it is said that Fulgrim is as humane and as loving of mankind as Sanguinius. He loves his sons, the legionaries, and ordinary mortals with equal strength, and he always wanted for them only the best, that perfect future toward which he always strove, a future open to beauty, to art, to happiness, and to love. Love is not mentioned here for nothing. Fulgrim, it seems to me, understood the nature of love far better than most. Here is a quotation from his reflections. He always set love above fear, simply because it was the stronger. Fear can be conquered, but love, never. At times it grows, at times it fades, but it never wholly disappears. To me, these are the words of a being acquainted with true love, which sadly, not everyone meets upon their path. It is no wonder that, in this light, the Phoenician was so admired. He was truly beautiful in every sense, pure of soul, open-hearted. And one more passage from the Reflections of Ferrus. To set the scene, a captain stands in a hospital with a lieutenant colonel of the medical corps, a memorable figure, partly modeled on a certain house-like doctor. But that is not our subject now. I quote, "The Space Marine raised his head, looked upon the other wounded in the tent, and in his trembling eyelids, in his eyes, could be read a compassion the deepest, such as even the captain of the Ultramarines never showed toward mortal soldiers." "How they suffer," whispered the captain. "The Great Crusade was meant to free mankind from the tyranny of aliens, not to replace it with this." End of quotation. And I am certain that the very same words could have been spoken by Fulgrim himself, for if his most faithful son speaks with such sincerity, then to the father, looking on what was unfolding, it would have been more painful still. Pride as a mask, the parallel with Dorian Gray. As for the legendary pride of Fulgrim, I think many have already grasped why he behaved as he did. And if any questions remain, I offer a quotation from his reflections, the words of the iterator Golconda. I quote, "Fulgrim was arrogant, or rather he affected arrogance, wore it as a mask, before that mask had grown into him, before it had turned into true haughtiness. Pride served the Phoenician as an extra layer of armor, a shield against a galaxy poised to strike swiftly at any weak point. Golconda knew the history of his childhood, full of hardship, deprivation, and dangers that would have driven an ordinary man mad. The slow, unwavering rise to power over a world. The Phoenician simply had no time for friendship." End of quotation. That description is familiar to many because, in the real world, to step away from the lore, people very often hide their young, vulnerable, simple souls behind pride and haughtiness. If they do not raise that barrier, the world will grind them down and twist them out of shape. It is not for nothing that I return to the parallel with the picture of Dorian Gray, which McNeill draws when he sets the portrait of Fulgrim in La Fenice beside Wilde's device. For this is exactly what happened to Dorian Gray. A pure and sincere, forthright youth meets the cruel world one-to-one, and having no defense, perishes, and his place is taken by a personality as cruel, as unprincipled, as twisted as the world around him. Fulgrim understood perfectly well what fate might befall him, and so he wore that mask, the mask of pride, as Golconda calls it. And few knew what he was truly like. Scarcely any of his brothers knew at all. Perhaps the Gorgon knew, but even in Ferrus's reflections there is no clear indication of it. Yet of Fulgrim's own sons, many understood. The cultured Lucius among them saw exactly who the Phoenician truly was. Fulgrim's fine nature does not deny certain negative traits, impulsiveness, for one. Golconda confirms this too. If you are provoked, you become aggressive and impetuous. But make no mistake, the Phoenician knew his own faults perfectly well. In support, I offer the thoughts of that same captain. Let his brother, Primarchs, conceal their flaws. Only by admitting his own shortcomings can he attain perfection. End of quotation. Having realized that pride had, after all, clouded his mind, Fulgrim says to himself in reproach, "Pride is your name." That is to say, he understood it all. He was capable of deep self-examination. He saw his weaknesses and fought them with all his strength. The clearest proof of this is how Golconda managed to see the moment when the Primarch, by an effort of will, mastered the dark wrath rising from the depths of his soul. I quote, "He fell silent for a moment, his features contorted, and Golconda glimpsed what lay hidden beneath that overly beautiful face. Then he smiled again, artfully returning the mask to its place. End of quotation. So Fulgrim has two masks, but he needs the mask not to shield himself from the world. He uses it to shield the world from himself, because he understands perfectly well that with his capabilities, he must never give way to wrath. Ferrus, for instance, did not understand this, and that confirms the great wisdom of the Primarch of the Third Legion, who truly understood how the world is made. The worldview of Fulgrim, the gears. I cannot fail to offer one of his exquisite meditations from his reflections, which characterizes him with the utmost precision. The quotation, "He is remembering Chemos." Then it was simpler. He distinguished good from bad without difficulty, and marked out his enemies with ease. But by that time, the Primarch had not yet grown up, and looked upon the world through the eyes of a child. Only afterward did he realize that reality is a complex mechanism full of moving parts, each of which performs its own function and may break down. When Fulgrim came to understand the working of that mechanism, concepts such as good and evil gave way, for him, to efficiency and necessity. A spoiled cog sometimes grinds loudly as you remove it, but the spoiled parts must be replaced for the sake of the machine as a whole. And yet, he acknowledged the worth even of broken cogs, for their purpose is defined not by the mechanism, but by the master. End of quotation. This meditation is of epic importance for understanding Fulgrim's character, in three respects at once. First, in a mere handful of phrases, the Primarch describes, with great compactness, the difference between the way a child and an adult see the world. For indeed, in childhood the world is simple and divides into black and white, and it is only with time that a person comes to see that a great deal is relative, and that often what looks from the outside like evil turns out, once you understand the motives, to be either the lesser evil or simple necessity, which from another point of view looks altogether different. Second, the idea of replacing spoiled parts for the sake of the machine as a whole speaks again to Fulgrim's fine nature. He feels any sacrifice most keenly. With this phrase, he is trying, by a philosophical syllogism, to explain to himself the importance and necessity of sacrifice. He does not want people to die, as that captain said, and he is trying to convince himself that in war it happens regardless, yet the question remains whether it is truly needed. Third, the closing thought that the purpose of the cogs is defined not by the mechanism, but by the master, describes the Primarchs themselves with the greatest precision. They did not choose their purpose. That choice was made for them by their maker, the Emperor. I think it was truly painful for Fulgrim to realize that he had been made for this cruel world, in which he could find no place, and so was forced to hide his true self. Hence his impulsiveness, his want of restraint. But whereas in the lion impulsiveness is, so to speak, the mark of a drawn-out adolescence, Fulgrim as a personality had long since matured, and what befell him was, one might say, a case of woe from wit. All of this was made worse by the fact that the Third Legion brought fewer worlds to compliance than any other, and had very nearly perished from a genetic defect at the outset. This constantly drove Fulgrim to be better for himself, for his sons, for the whole Imperium. In a very human way, he wished to prove the opposite, that his Emperor's children were not weak, that they were worthy to take their place in the great designs of mankind. Hence his whole theme of the search for perfection, for the unreachable ideal. In support, again, a quotation from his reflections. Decades of disappointment had turned him into a shadow of what he had been. Bowed beneath the weight of his troubles, Fulgrim sometimes dreamed of returning to the factory fortresses of his youth. Then he had been content with life, full of simple aspirations. Now everything seemed to him too vast, and the Primarchs struggled, it seemed, hour by hour, with the difficulties of a new existence. End of quotation. In this lies the undoubted tragedy of Fulgrim. He was made a part of a world in which he did not wish to live. End note. The Phoenician understood the roots of his own longing perfectly well. He did not turn bitter. He never sought to wound anyone deliberately or to set himself above his brothers, unlike, say, Ferrus. He did not wish to be war master. He cared nothing for power. Instead, Fulgrim consoled himself with what he called his small joys. I quote from his reflections. "Come, we are leaving aboard my personal ship." The Primarch pointed to one of the craft. It surpassed its neighbors in size, and in the span of its wings, gracefully swept back, and its blunt nose, after his alterations, resembled a beak. Golconda and her companion, naturally, cooed their approval, and the Phoenician preened. "I designed and built her myself. On the gun deck, the fastest transport in the whole expeditionary fleet." "And that matters?" she asked. Fulgrim smiled. "Only to me." End of quotation. That is what is meant by his small joys. Where Ferrus nearly killed his friend, where Angron incinerated worlds, venting his fury, the Phoenician built the fastest transport in the whole expeditionary fleet. That is how he consoled himself. Fulgrim as a statesman and his role. He was not only wise and kind, but a superb statesman, in this sense perhaps, no less than Horus. His wish to bring the world of Byzas to heel with just 7 warriors is one more proof of this. Here is a quotation, so as not to be unfounded. Fulgrim ground down his enemies, simply because it was his habit. He had grown used to it on Chemos, where the Primarch had to maneuver among rival spheres of influence, unhurriedly dismantling and rebuilding the ancient clan system, like a machine long since obsolete, which created more problems than it solved. Now the same thing was happening, but on a far greater scale. To govern the territories seized in the Great Crusade, a new bureaucracy was being raised, hostile to the very elements under its control. His brother Primarchs did not yet understand this, perhaps only Horus suspected, but Fulgrim had grown up amid such mechanisms of power and recognized at once their hidden danger. End of quotation. That is how precisely he describes what a vast state becomes, which chimes with the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes. Fulgrim, perhaps as well as anyone, understood what was becoming of the Imperium and that something had to be done about it. And now, the most important thing, the apotheosis, the very thing set in the title of the stream. Fulgrim agreed to follow his father because he believed in the dream of a future for all mankind. But the question must arise, what role did he cast for himself in this grand drama? He answers it himself in a quotation from his reflections. "Instability breeds violence, and violence ends in death. Only it is not the powerful and wealthy who die, but the laborers of the factories and the fields, which means that the duty of the strong is to protect the weak." To my mind, that answers with the utmost clarity the question of who Fulgrim truly was, what he wanted, and why he was one of the worthiest of the Primarchs. Fulgrim as a swordsman. To close, I will dwell on one more matter, secondary but interesting. How strong was Fulgrim as a swordsman? It is generally held that in the arts of peace he showed himself a great master. On the flagship Pride of the Emperor, for instance, there was a whole hall lined with magnificent sculptures depicting the great warriors and leaders of the Legion, and all of them Fulgrim carved himself, though after his wounding they were spoiled, and many destroyed. But how good was he as a warrior in the art of the duel? That he defeated Guilliman in single combat means nothing, for Guilliman is no first-rank duelist. Many bested him. For all his fine qualities, among his brothers he was plainly not one of the foremost warriors. The duel of Fulgrim and Ferrus seems more telling, but the trouble is that we do not know Ferrus's true strength. To gauge the might of the Lord of Iron, recall this. He would invite all his brothers to spar, having built a special cage on the flagship. We know that Vulcan declined, and Fulgrim declined too. It is known that Ferrus fought the Emperor. Ferrus defeated a legendary creature, one that by common account is a work of the Necrons. By legend, its skin flowed onto the hands of Ferrus after he had bested it. Given that we are speaking of the living metal from which, as we know, the bodies of the C'tan were made, one may suppose that this creature was, in all likelihood, a shard of one of the C'tan, like the one the Emperor defeated on Terra. If so, then Manus was simply incredibly strong. Beyond that, we have his victory over one of the avatars of Cain, significant because Ferrus overcame a colossal foe at the tomb through sheer prowess, physical might, and extraordinary gift, all while under psychic pressure, which counts further in his favor. But Ferrus lost to Fulgrim twice in real combat. And it was not Fulgrim who killed him, but, as I said, the demon by the Phoenician's hands. So in mortal combat, Fulgrim did surpass Manus. Add to that Fulgrim himself had earlier defeated an avatar of Cain, albeit with the Laer blade's power behind him. And the summoning of an avatar of Cain is a singular event, occurring once in an age. Its price is the life of an exarch, and exarchs can be counted on the fingers. Such an avatar ought, in principle, to possess truly incredible power. It is the embodiment of a god, perhaps one of the ancient ones, and Fulgrim overcame it. Add, too, that Golconda says in the Reflections that, by common account, Fulgrim was the nimblest of the brothers. But this is scarcely conclusive, for agility, while an important quality, is far from the only significant factor. And so, in truth, we can only suppose that Fulgrim was, indeed, a strong warrior. But beyond supposition, we cannot go, for we simply have nothing to compare him with. Ferrus's true strength, for instance, we do not know either, for he never truly fought any of his fellows. Conclusion. And now the very end. I have tried to show, as plainly as I can, what Fulgrim truly was. Kind, genuinely humane, and tender. Without doubt a great swordsman, and a leader no less great. A skilled strategist, and a fine diplomat. He knew that he was made for war, yet he strove for peace and inspired others by his example. He knew how to value life, his own and others. He knew what love was, and wished for love to truly reign over the galaxy. And all this despite the fact that Fulgrim did not wish to live in this world, because the cruelty of this world was destroying him. He was too fine of soul, and too sensitive to remain himself in such a world, and so he wore a mask to preserve his true self. And the Fulgrim the Emperor had envisioned, without doubt, died in the very instant that he took up the silver blade. A fair question. Where lay his guilt? Had he known of chaos, he would have understood whom the Laer truly worshipped, and would hardly have laid a hand on that accursed sword. Fulgrim was no reckless gambler. He planned everything, weighed the risks, and knowing what the price might be, would never have touched the Laer blade. But he did not believe in gods, as his father had ordered, and so he was left simply defenseless before the gods of chaos. And even when he managed to regain command of his body, he could no longer rid himself of the demon or of the warp's influence. The demon remained with him forever, going on eroding a Fulgrim who had long since ceased to be himself. In the end, the treason of the Phoenician was in no way his choice, just as the fate of the conqueror, Angron, was not his choice. Fulgrim did not even fight anyone on Chemos. In both cases, he proved to be no more than an instrument in the hands of powers whose capabilities exceeded his own from the very start. But to my mind, there is hope, because the clone of Fabius showed that the true Fulgrim would never have accepted the position of Horus. I believe Bile was mistaken. His father would not, a second time, have made the same mistake had he known what the Immaterium truly is and who rules it. And in closing, I will venture that the Phoenix will, after all, one day be reborn. At the very least, I hope so. Thank you for listening to the very end. If this deep dive was worth your time, drop a like and subscribe. There is far more of the Long War still to explore. Until next time. Transmission ends. The Emperor protects.